Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us. My name is Bob Kopp. I'm a climate scientist and director of the Rutgers Institute of Earth, Ocean, and Atmospheric Sciences at Rutgers University. And I'm very pleased to welcome you today to this reading and panel discussion of Kim Stanley Robinson's new novel, The Ministry of the Future, which tells a near-future story of human struggle and resilience in the face of escalating climate risk. Before we begin, I want to thank the people who have made this event happen. Stan and our panelists, and also Lynn Travaccino, the Associate Director of the Rutgers Institute of Earth, Ocean, and Atmospheric Sciences, Marjorie Kaplan, the Associate Director of the Rutgers Climate Institute, Carrie Ferraro, the Associate Director of Rutgers Coastal Climate Risk and Resilience Initiative, and Matt Drews, the Institute's Digital Media Coordinator. I also want to acknowledge that Rutgers sits on the traditional land of the Lenape people and honor the Lenape and other indigenous caretakers of these lands, past, present, and future. We are gathering virtually at a time of overlapping and interfingering crises. The immediate economic and public health crises, crises of racial and geopolitical injustice that have been simmering for centuries, and the rapidly escalating crises of global climate, ecology, and democracy. While the climate crisis traces its origins to the Industrial Revolution and the start of the fossil fuel economy, the hard numeric truth is that most of the carbon dioxide humanity has put in the atmosphere has been put there since the late 1980s. This is a problem that was largely created in my lifetime, and I do not think it is a mere coincidence that it has coincided with the rapid growth of inequality and the slowdown of democratization in the United States. My job as a climate scientist is to study how we are changing the planet and the ways in which different courses of actions we might take over the coming decades are likely to shape the planet in which we and our children live. And frankly, I think we climate scientists have done our job in this regard, and it can be boiled down to a single sentence. Every ton of carbon dioxide we put into the atmosphere makes the planet hotter, and it's going to keep getting hotter and more challenging to live in until we stop putting carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. But until recently, I think there have been few climate scientists and few of those who are perhaps better suited to the task, like humanists, social scientists, and policy scholars, who have provided concrete visions of how we get to a more sustainable future. Our guest tonight is one of the exceptions. Kim Stanley Robinson has spent decades writing award-winning works of fiction about the experience of people struggling through societal and environmental crises to build a better, though still imperfect, world. Stan's work is often work of earth science fiction. While he sometimes emphasizes low probability but high impact possibilities to advance the plot, he generally gets the fundamentals of how planets operate as an integrated systems fundamentally right, which is why I, as a climate scientist, have always really liked his work. But he also, frankly, has been ahead of the earth sciences in always treating humans as integrated parts of the planetary system. And his works are also always as much works of social science fiction as earth science fiction. Stan last spoke at Rutgers in 2016 about his book, New York 2140. Since then, thankfully, there's been a blossoming of positive visions of the future in the policy arena, with the movement for a Green New Deal, and most especially the youth activists of the Sunrise Movement in the United States, largely responsible for injecting these into the American public conscience. The last couple of years, we've also seen a wave of nonfiction in the same spirit. A whole bunch of books explicitly on the Green New Deal, including our panelist Naomi Klein's On Fire, and also works like Eric Holthouse's Future Earth, and the amazing collection of essays and poems by women climate leaders, All We Can Save, which came out a couple weeks ago. It even has nonfiction writers and activists step forward with positive visions. I think that literature still has a critically important role to play in making the lived experience of a better future and the struggle to get there tangible, even as we can hope that some of the literary licenses taken to make that experience more exciting may prove to be more extreme than reality. And so I think it behooves us to pay close attention to science fiction that grapples with our intertwining crises of climate and democracy, exactly the sort of fiction that Stan has been writing since the 1980s. I'm going to turn it over to Stan in a moment to introduce and read from his book. But before I do, I want to introduce the three Rutgers panelists who will speak after him. Our first panelist will be Naomi Klein, who is the inaugural Gloria Steinem Endowed Chair in Media, Culture, and Feminist Studies. She's an award-winning journalist and New York Times bestselling author, a senior correspondent for The Intercept, and a Puffin Writing Fellow at Tight Media Center. She's going to provide a perspective on the ministry for the future from the viewpoint of the movement for climate justice. International environmental organizations are central players in the Ministry for the Future, which is why our second panelist will be Cymie Payne, who is an associate professor of human ecology focusing on international and environmental laws. She is also chair of the International Union for the Conservation of Nature's World Commission on Environmental Law, Oceans, Coasts, and Coral Reef Specialist Group, and formerly served as legal counsel with the UN Security Council's United Nations Compensation Commission. She's going to provide a perspective on the role of international environmental governance in advancing climate justice. And finally, Jorge Marcone is an associate professor in the Department of Spanish and Portuguese. His research focuses on the impact of popular and indigenous environmentalisms and current ecological thinking, the interrelationships between humans and non-humans, and their affinities with theories of sustainability and community resilience. He's going to provide a perspective on the world of planetary scale science fiction of the sort that Stan writes in the environmental humanities. Throughout the reading and panel discussion, I want to encourage you to submit questions for Stan and the panel through the chat function. We will collect these and address them after Stan's response to the panelists' remarks. I also want to let you all know that this session is being recorded and will be made available after the event through EOS's YouTube channel. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Kim Stanley Robinson to introduce and read from his new novel, The Ministry for the Future.
Hi there, people. How are we doing?
Good. You need to turn on your video stream.
Ah, yes. Okay. I have. And thanks, Bob. And with Rutgers. Brief selections. It'll take about 8 minutes from the novel, and we'll go on from there. So this will just be a kind of sampler of the kind of thing that the book involves, and I've chosen passages that somewhat explain it. Here we go. It was getting hotter. Frank May got off his mat and padded over to look out the window. Umber stucco walls and tiles, the color of the local clay. Square apartment blocks like the one he was in, rooftop patios occupied by residents who had moved up there in the night, it being too hot to sleep inside. Now quite a few of them are standing behind their chest-high walls looking east. Sky the color of the buildings. Frank took a deep breath. It reminded him of the air in a sauna. This the coolest part of the day. In his entire life, he had spent less than 5 minutes in saunas. He didn't like the sensation. Hot water, maybe. Hot, humid air, no. He didn't see why anyone would seek out such a stifling, sweaty feeling. Here there was no escaping it. He wouldn't have agreed to come here if he had thought it through. It was his hometown sister city, but there were other sister cities, other aid organizations. Now, sweat was slipping into his eyes and stinging. He was wet, wearing only a pair of shorts. Those too were wet. There were wet patches on his mat where he had tried to sleep. He was thirsty, and the jug by his bedside was empty. All over town, the stressed hum of window box air conditioner fans buzzed like giant mosquitoes. And then the sun cracked the eastern horizon. It blazed like an atomic bomb, which of course it was. The fields and buildings underneath that brilliant chip of light went dark, then darker still as the chip flowed to the sides in a burning line, and then bulged to a crescent he couldn't look at. The heat coming from it was palpable, a slap to the face. Solar radiation heating the skin of his face, making him blink, stinging eyes flowing. He couldn't see much. Everything was tan and beige, and a brilliant, unbearable white. Ordinary town in Uttar Pradesh, 6 a.m. He looked at his phone, 38 degrees. In Fahrenheit, that was, he tapped, 103 degrees. Humidity about 35%. The combination was the thing. A few years ago, it would have been among the hottest wet bulb temperatures ever recorded. Now just a Wednesday morning. Wails of dismay cut the air coming from the rooftop across the street. Cries of distress, a pair of young women leaning over a wall calling down to the street. Someone on that roof was not waking up. Frank tapped at his phone, called the police. No answer. With the dawn, people were discovering sleepers in distress, finding those who would never wake up for the long, hot night, calling for help. Sirens seemed to indicate some of the calls had worked. Frank checked his phone again. It was charged. It showed a connection, but no reply at the police station. He had 2 months to go. 58 days, way too long. July 12th, monsoon not yet arrived. Focus on getting through today, one day at a time. Then home to Jacksonville, comically cool after this. He would have stories to tell, with the poor people on the rooftop across the way. Then the sound of the air conditioners cut off, more cries of distress. His phone no longer showed any bars. Electricity gone. Brownout, blackout. Generators were already firing up, loud two-stroke engines. Illegal gas, diesel, kerosene, save for situations like these when the law requiring use of liquid natural gas gave way to necessity. The air, already bad, would soon be a blanket of exhaust, like breathing from the exhaust pipe of an old bus. Sirens like the wails of gods and goddesses, the whole Hindu pantheon in distress. Be it resolved that a subsidiary body authorized by this 29th Conference of the Parties, serving it as the meeting of the parties to the Paris Climate Agreement, is hereby established to work with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and all the agencies of the United Nations and all the government signatories to the Paris Agreement to advocate for the world's future generations of citizens whose rights, as defined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, are as valid as our own. This new subsidiary body is furthermore charged with defending all living creatures present and future who cannot speak for themselves by promoting their legal standing and physical protection. Someone in the press named this new agency the Ministry for the Future, and the name stuck and spread and became what the new agency was usually called. It was established in Zurich, Switzerland, in January of 2025, and not long after that, the big heat wave struck India. Hosting a meeting of a dozen or 20 of the most powerful people on Earth, which meant also accommodating large staffs for each of them, was a big job, but one that the Swiss were used to performing. For this meeting, there were too many people for the ministry offices to hold, so they held the meeting in Congress Hall, down by the lake. The morning they convened, the broad picture windows spanning the south wall of the big room provided them with the pathetic fallacy in full measure. A spring storm lashed the Zurich See, with low, shifting gray clouds dropping black brooms of rain onto the silvery lake surface, the windows running wild with deltas of rainwater kaleidoscoping this view. Nothing unusual in that, no LA-like climate apocalypse here, just Zurich spring weather as usual, but still very fitting given the mood in the room, which was one of grim virtue. They would weather this storm, they said to each other while looking out at it, and all the stark emotions of the room were heightened by the dark metallic sublimity of the rain-lashed whitecaps on the lake and the sound of the wind ripping through the flailing trees. Mary Murphy brought them to order. She reminded them of the meetings she had had with them over the past few years in which she had urged them to create a new currency of their own collaboration based on carbon sequestration and exchangeable on currency exchanges. Money like other money, but backed by the central banks working together and securitized by the creation of really long-term bonds, bonds with a century payout at a guaranteed rate of return large enough to tempt anyone interested in fiscal stability. In essence, as she had been saying, creating a way to invest in survival, to go long on civilization, as opposed to the many ingenious ways that finance had found to short civilization. Thus, in the process, shifting most of the surplus value created in the last 4 decades to the richest 2% of the population, making those few so rich they could imagine surviving the crash of civilization, they and their descendants living on into some poorly imagined gated community post-apocalypse in which servants and food and fuel and games would still be available to them. No way, she said to the bankers, not a chance that would happen. Shorting civilization and imagining living on in some fortress island of the mind was another fantasy to escape, one of many that rich people entertained, as ridiculous as retreating to Mars. Money was worthless if there was no civilization to back it, no civilization to make things to buy, things like food. So even if the central bankers were regarding their task in the very narrowest terms as stabilizing prices and helping the employment rate, and more than anything else, preserving the perceived value of money itself, to do that now, they had to leave their usual monetarist silos and regard themselves as what they were, the not-so-secret government of the world. In that capacity, something more was now called for than merely adjusting their interest rates. They were shocked by her bluntness, by her disgust for their timidity. These Irish, they were thinking. She could see that. but they were also paying very close attention to her. They were transfixed, the storm outside forgotten. Now the storm was in the room, in the form of one angry, intense, middle-aged woman. Well, she had to remember, when a meeting got hot, it was usually going badly. This was a calculated risk, getting their attention by lashing them a bit. Now she had to calm it down, so she did that. The last time she had asked them to do this, she reminded them they had refused her. Now the situation was different. It was so much worse it could hardly be believed. And as the current representative in their midst of all the future generations to come, she was going to have to insist that they act. She was open to their suggestions as how to best to act. Possibly the Bank for International Settlements could be brought out of its 20th century time capsule and used as an instrument for this, but they must act because civilization was trembling on the brink. They were going down. Here, the pathetic fallacy of an ordinary Zerk, a spring storm helped bring her point home. The wind was really howling now. The air was black, though it was just before noon. The whole lake was slamming into the windows and blurring the view, the wind clarifying it with a blast time after time. It was almost as rainy as Galway. All central banks were undemocratic technocracies, not that dissimilar to China's. They were run by financial elites who did what they felt was best without consulting even their own legislatures, much less the citizens of their countries. As institutions, they were in fact specifically designed to function outside any legislative or democratic whims, the better to keep the financial ship of the world steadily sailing on into the great west of universal prosperity. For the elites first, and everyone else if they could be accommodated without endangering the elites on the first-class deck. So an invitation to become more undemocratic, if couched diplomatically enough, would not be entirely unwelcome to this crowd. It would be a matter of how one phrased it. The specific principal tasks that central banks were charged with could no longer be fulfilled if the climate emergency got out of hand. In other words, central banks would fail in their principal tasks if they did not save the civilization that had charged them with those tasks. And although it was true that full employment would always remain a key objective for them, she finished. It wasn't such a victory if the remnant of humanity that survived the crash ended up working as scavengers and peasant farmers. That wasn't the kind of full employment that the world had in mind when central banks were created. She saw the bankers were offended at this final sarcasm and pondered for a moment, simply shouting suddenly in their faces or taking her shoe off and pounding the table in Khrushchev style, or throwing a chair through the picture window and letting the storm pouring over them. Sudden fury at their mulishness. Fuck your inflation rates, she wanted to shout. Do the job only you can do. And judging by their faces, it was possible that her own face held all these sentiments and imagined actions and curses perfectly visible in the way she was looking at them. The power of the eye. Not Medusa, turning them to stone or killing them with a strike from a snake on her head. Instead, she fervently hoped some kind of electrical jumpstart applied by jumper cables that had her two eyes as the contact grips, leaping the gap from mind to mind. Yes, she was very close to losing it. And then she saw that the Chinese finance minister was grinning broadly and not even trying to hide it. She checked her cheat sheet. Who was this woman again? Madame Chan, daughter of a finance minister from the generation before. A child of the party hierarchy, like she had been, and so many others. Mary liked her look. Very briefly here. Everyone knows me, but no one can tell me. No one knows me, even though everyone has heard my name. Everyone talking together makes something that seems like me, but is not me. Everyone doing things in the world makes me. I am blood in the streets, the catastrophe you can never forget. I am the tide turning under the world that no one sees or feels. I happen in the present, but I'm told only in the future. And then they think they speak of the past, but really they are always speaking about the present. I do not exist, and yet I am everything. You know what I am. I am history. Now make me good. Thanks, folks, for the opportunity, and let's turn it back to Bob.
Great. Thank you, Stan. That's very, very gripping. Thanks for that reading. So I'm going to turn it over now to our first panelist, who is Naomi Klein.
Thank you, Bob, and thank you, Stan, for that amazing reading and for this wonderful book. Can everybody hear me okay? Give me a thumbs up. Okay, cool. Thanks. All right. Okay, I'm just going to keep track of time. Well, first, I always feel so grateful to Kim Stanley Robinson. I quote you, as you know, Stan, quite a lot. We first met when you came to one of the book signing for This Changes Everything and had me sign the epigraph, which was a quote from you. And I'm going to read that quote now. "In my books, I've imagined people salting the Gulf Stream, damming the glaciers, sliding off the Greenland ice cap, pumping ocean water into the dry basins of the Sahara and Asia to create salt seas, pumping melted ice from Antarctica north to provide fresh water, genetically engineering bacteria to sequester more carbon in the roots of trees, raising Florida 30 feet to get it back above water, and, hardest of all, comprehensively changing capitalism." So I thought that was such a great opening quote for a book about the tension between the logic of capitalism and the logic of a finite planet. And so I think there's some rule that you're not supposed to use the same author for another epigraph, but I quoted Kim Stanley Robinson again at the start of On Fire as the epigraph, and I'll read that as well. "The future isn't cast into one inevitable course. On the contrary, we could cause the sixth great mass extinction event in Earth's history, or we could create a prosperous civilization sustainable over the long haul. Either is possible starting from now." John Powell, who heads the Othering and Belonging Institute at Berkeley, when he's asked whether he's an optimist, he responds that he's a possibilist. And I think that idea of just holding on to what is possible and rejecting the idea of inevitable apocalyptic futures is something I've always really valued in Kim Stanley Robinson's work. And I think during the times of COVID, I've also been thinking a lot about an essay that you wrote, Stan, in the New Yorker early on, where you described the moment that we are living as us all now being stuck in a science fiction novel that we are writing together. And I think if there's anything optimistic that we can say about the period that we are in, it is that kind of feeling that with all the rules being broken all around us, that it creates a feeling of possibility for better and worse. As Arundhati Roy said, the pandemic is a kind of a portal, and where we are going is not where we came from. We're going somewhere different. It could be a lot worse. We see reminders of that every day. On the other hand, it could be potentially better, though by no means ideal. I think ideal left the building quite some time ago. But the world is feeling perhaps more flexible, like it might be possible to build something new within the bounds of the laws of chemistry and physics, which are not negotiable. So this is one of the things that I've always appreciated about Kim Stanley Robinson's work is that it occupies this in-between space between apocalyptic or dystopian futures and wild-eyed optimism. It seems to be rejecting both of these narrative structures, which really strikes me as very important. A lot of the literature that we now call cli-fi, which reckons with the future of ecological collapse, is actively dystopian, as we know. And this has been true for a long time. Various imaginings that take current trends, wealth inequality, ecological unraveling, hypermasculinity, religious fundamentalism, and dial them all up to the max in an effort to show us where we are headed. And some version of that future has been the plot lines of countless books, films, television series. Many of them are very good. And we all know the story. A small group of extremely rich people fortress themselves in their first-class palaces / space stations / trains and turn their weapons on the hordes of locked out and enraged poor scavenging in landscapes of ecological collapse. And don't get me wrong, I liked Mad Max Fury Road. I even liked Elysium. And I like many of these films and TV series and books. And I think that they are authored, for the most part, with the best of intentions, with this idea that they are going to serve as wake-up calls or warnings, telling us that if we stay on the road we're on, we will end up somewhere no one wants to go, so we'd better swerve. But I've thought for some years now that the catch is that if the only portrayals of the future we ever see are some mix and match of fascism and ecological collapse, then these apocalyptic narratives start to feel less like warnings and more like weather forecasts, pictures of an inevitable future, predictions we can do almost nothing about. And it strikes me that this may be because apocalyptic collapse with a small group of winners is so hardwired in Judeo-Christian narratives, from Noah's Ark that survives the flood to, of course, the rapture, where a small group of believers are lifted up to that gated kingdom in the sky, while non-believers are swallowed up in the hell they/we apparently deserve. The power of that plot line seems particularly relevant given the powerful positions occupied by Christian nationalists in the Trump administration and perhaps soon the Supreme Court, Mike Pompeo, Mike Pence, Betsy DeVos. Because if you truly believe that the point of faith is to be among the saved when the end times come, then the many intersecting crises we are currently living through, the diseases, the fires, the floods, the extinctions, the hunger, the political mayhem, should not be seen as terrifying warning signs that we are careening towards that dystopian future, but on the contrary, they're items on a preordained rapture checklist, proof positive that the exciting end is nigh, so pray harder to make sure you are among the saved. It seems to me that apocalyptic imaginaries are very powerful things, and that's part of why we need pictures of possible futures that follow a different storyline. Futures where things don't just careen from bad to worse to unbearable. On the other hand, for a more positive futurism to be more than that wild-eyed fantasy, there has to be a credible path to arrive at that better place, to get from here to there. And that's what I think is being offered to us in the Ministry for the Future. It rejects apocalyptic futures, but of course, Stan, you go to great pains to show that avoiding that path, while it's possible, we are going to be living with enormous loss. And I had read descriptions of the book as a kind of a utopian future. So I made the mistake of reading the first chapter before bed, and I think we've definitely lowered the bar on utopia if we are starting there. So I mean, one of the things I wanted to just ask you about is whether you do see this as utopian sci-fi. It is such a near future that to me it really felt just hyper real, and yeah, it's hardly a commune in space when it comes to utopia. So I wanted to ask you about that term, and then I found myself just before this conference began. I got asked for comment about the Nobel Prize announcement is coming tomorrow, and there's some speculation that Greta Thunberg and Fridays for the Future may win the Nobel this year. It's probably going to be the WHO, given everything, but it could be Greta and Fridays for the Future. So I was also wondering whether the title of the book, The Ministry for the Future, was at all inspired by the Fridays for the Future movement. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Naomi. And so now I want to turn it over to Cymie Payne.
Stan, thank you for this book. And Bob, thank you for the invitation to join this fireside conversation about Ministry for the Future. This book is an impressive horizon scan of the institutions, activities, human psychology, and especially systemic issues that fuel climate action, but also that block it. In it, you propose that the international financial system must be entirely overhauled, as depicted in one of the scenes that you read. But you don't suggest such a wholesale reconstruction of international law. As you accurately describe it, the kind of international cooperation that's needed to address climate change is based in national governments. So in the next few minutes, I want to describe the evolution of international law, which is treated in the book as relatively toothless in the face of the climate crisis, to include more than national governments, to suggest why this expansion from purely national control is a good thing and why it could be a bad thing. So throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, diplomacy was conducted between states, and neither the environment nor individuals, let alone future generations, were considered as having their own legal interests that had to be respected. In the last 30 years, this has really changed. The interests of foreign investors as against their host governments have been affirmed through privileges conferred by investment treaties, and the rights of individuals have been recognized through the growing system of human rights. The rights of the international community to speak independently of governments and across national boundaries is increasingly recognized, especially in environmental treaty regimes. The United Nations Climate Change Convention, which is the overarching climate regime within which the Paris Agreement and therefore the future Ministry for the Future is embedded, created space for groups representing human society from environmental organizations to youth, to trade unions, to researchers, to industry, allowing them to observe and to speak during the government-to-government meetings. These kinds of meetings in the past would have always been behind closed doors and conducted by foreign policy elites. I currently work on negotiations at the UN for a treaty on biodiversity in the ocean beyond national waters, with a large network of such organizations, from advocacy groups like Greenpeace to scientific groups like the Deep Ocean Stewardship Initiative, which advises and helps link science and policy. The organization that I'm affiliated with, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, is itself a hybrid of government and non-governmental members. Civil society provides expertise, it proposes solutions, and it bears witness on behalf of humanity. And at the same time, there's been a move toward, and I quote, from Ministry for the Future, legal standing for those future people and creatures and things without standing. I should probably drop a legalistic footnote here for those who aren't in my classes, that legal standing is the right to come before a court. It's legal personality. And we see that, for example, in Ecuador, Mother Earth has legal standing in the Constitution. In New Zealand, the Whanganui River is recognized as possessing legal rights. This is a movement that has spread over the last 50 years. This increasing openness to non-governmental organizations of society can provide a direct voice for the voiceless. It can provide essential scientific and traditional knowledge, and it can balance the interests of the powerful when these voices are allowed into international discussions and negotiations and decision-making. And there are ambitious proposals for organizations that are non-governmental to act as stewards or trustees for Earth. However, the questions posed in this book highlight the tension between decision-making by elites, whether they're power elites or elites by virtue of expertise, and the global community. Consider some of the issues raised in Ministry for the Future. Stopping the use of fossil fuels globally, deploying a form of geoengineering that involves delivering sulfur dioxide aerosols to the upper atmosphere, changing the very color of the sky, even if only just a little bit, maybe. And restructuring the global financial system. So it's a question I think about a lot, and I want to offer as a provocation to engender further conversation that I would like to listen to. Who should and who can make decisions about such things for humanity and for the rest of the life forms that live on Earth? Should it be governments, as it chiefly is today? An advantage of national governments is that almost everybody on Earth is represented by one. Should it be experts who understand the central banks and the geoengineering technology? Should it be the entire population of Earth through crowdsourcing or some such system? Consider that in light of current debates in the US, on the one hand favoring a popular vote for president, and on the other hand deploring populism. Can there be global democracy, given the range of forms of government, cultures, and norms? I want to quote again from Ministry for the Future. This was one of my favorite lines. They all lived in their languages, and if your native language was anything but English, you were estranged to one degree or another from the global village. And yet the world's lingua franca was a permanent soft power. So I advocate in my work for a blended solution where we strive for a balance. Maybe it's because I'm an international lawyer and I'm also an American steeped in democracy and inspired by the civil rights movement, by the environmental movement of the 1970s, and by the Sunrise Movement and its fellows of today. So Stan, you run with Tom Athanasio's point that climate change can't be solved without restructuring our financial system. And I agree with you. What is your view of whether the legal system can be left more or less as the state-based structure we have today? And again, such deep thanks.
Thank you, Cymie. And now I want to turn it over to our final panelist, Jorge Marcone.
Can you hear me? Okay. Thank you, Bob, and thank you, Stan, again for a wonderful book that gives us so many things to think about. I'm going to use my time for bringing up 5 aspects or questions regarding the novel that you may want to address or not later on, but I think I will also want to share with the audience for understanding the many things that you are bringing us through this book. The first one is the focus on extreme weather, which makes the kind of the baseline for the action carried by the protagonist of the book is the consequences of extreme weather, right? Is post-traumatic syndrome disorder, which basically sets everything in motion in the book. And I thought that was valuable, not only because what it does in the book, but I think you were also telling us in a way that we are losing focus on that. And I'm going to quote from the book. This is what Bob Wharton, the leading ecologist in Mary Murphy's team in the Minister for the Future, at certain point says, some things can be mitigated, some we can't. Some things we can adapt to, others we can't. Also, we can't adapt to some things we are now failing to mitigate. Need to clarify which is which. Mainly need to tell adaptation advocates they are full of shit. Bunch of economists, humanities professors, they have no idea what we're talking about. Adaptation, just fantasy. This first aspect of the novel led me to another one, and it's that in your book, all these events of extreme weather seem to be the catalyst for another dimension of activism that I think we don't have yet, and that is violent activism. There is a lot of violence here perpetrated against carbon producers, against carbon emitters, against those who benefit from disasters, as a response to the violence that they are getting from these agents. Maybe I should not be surprised that in a scenario of the future, violence can be part of environmental activism. But on the other hand, I was not surprised. The fact that I was surprised reminded me that one of the important things about the environmental movement is that in spite of all this difference, it's a commitment for change based on democracy, and it's a peaceful change, even though it can be confrontational. So I thought that was a very interesting warning that either we have to start cherishing what is part of the environmental movement, because there is a big chance that this may go away. Another aspect that I appreciated very much in the book was the fact that your protagonists were bureaucrats, that were that people that work with state or international agencies. They are not, in a way, they are the elite, but they are not the elite. It's the kind of work that I think we have overlooked until recently, until we have started seeing these officers and offices disappear. When Bolsonaro shuts down the environmental agency in Brazil, or when things happen in the United States, we start to realize that these are important factors, important agencies in the process. And it's not only you, I think there is a switch in the narrative towards putting some focus on the guardians, so to speak. My last two, about the Minister for the Future. I had a comment similar to Cymie, in the sense that if, after all, the ministry itself is not another elite. It's an elite that complains about an elite that is above them, but still they are not accountable to anybody, and they seem not to reach out to anybody in particular. Maybe because of the nature of the job they are doing, it is necessary, but I thought that gave me a lot to think about. Aside to that, and I don't know if you want to engage in this, but there is a lot of contempt in this book for microeconomy, and particularly for microeconomists, not only for bankers, but for microeconomists. And I wish I would be eventually in an occasion in which I can see you debate with microeconomists about all this. And finally is the question about the novel. Why the novel? Why such genre, and particularly the way you write it in very long books? Why keep on trying the novel now? On the one hand, you don't have to answer to this. But on the other hand, the book itself encourages us to think that, after all, this is a war of words. This is a war of ideas. And if that is the situation, then we have to discuss about our genres, about the mediums in which this war can take place. I'm sure you have been asked before about your choice, your literary choice here, but I think it will be always useful to hear about it again. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Great. Thanks, Jorge. And so, Stan, I think there was a lot of ideas brought up by those three panelists. You want to start just by picking up those ideas you want to play off of?
Yes, Bob, thank you. And thank you, for your comments. A lot of our meeting in Rutgers a few years ago, and I must express how grateful I am to this format and for the people and their comments, because you write novels, and I mean, I'm seeing the reviews from Ministry, and I have to say that reviews end up being about plot summary and judgment, thumbs up, thumbs down, and not analysis or discussion and so I'm so grateful for this kind of a conversation, which is really what I intend when I write these books anyway. Now, I lost the middle of Naomi's talk. I'm very sorry. I hope that my own lamentations and curses were not audible to you in the midst of that, but I think not, because I literally lost power here in Maine and lost a moment of it. But I did hear at the very end Naomi asking about perhaps the concept of utopia. And I would just like to say that science fiction has a basic split, dystopia, utopia. It aligns perfectly with our fears and our hopes. And everybody is a science fiction writer of their own life. When you think about your future, you have fears and you have hopes. And if you focus too much on your fears, you have a serious problem, a psychological problem that can become existential. But luckily, hope is very biological. And the literature of hope, utopian, when you have social hopes that the society might be better. Well, this is a fairly small body of literature. It often seems dry. People talk about it being boring. But I feel like because we are never going to reach any kind of perfected state, not even close, that the utopian fiction is really about trying to make things better in tangible ways. And so that's my definition of utopian fiction, is just a description of a positive course in history with no end state. And these are worth writing, and I'm glad to see that there's a powerful movement of young writers trying to write them. Cymie, you talked about international law, and it was super interesting to me. I feel incapable of grasping the strange dialectic between the nation-state system and international law. And I do feel that there's a certain toothlessness. I spent a lot of time studying the Antarctic Treaty, and therefore the Outer Space Treaty, which is based on the Antarctic Treaty. And the Antarctic Treaty had a little bit to do with the law of the sea. These spaces that are international commons, the people can become very idealistic there, especially when there aren't any resources to exploit. And that's not true of the ocean, but it is true of Antarctica by and large. And the problem is there is no sheriff. So when the resources get exploited, what you find is that the international law seems to lose force under the competition between nation-state systems. And all I can say about that is it is the system we're in. We're stuck in it. We've got to deal with it. In this book, as in all of my work, I've been trying to write about not a fresh start on another planet, but what can we do here and now in the historical situation that we're faced with. And I would love to see the international legal system get more buy-in from the powerful nation states, and then the rest of them would follow. But this is perhaps one of the more utopian gestures. And I suppose what I did in the Ministry for the Future and in general is to shift from the legal system to its major manifestation in the economic system. So the economic system we live in, global capitalism, is indeed a legal system. It's the rule of law for the world at large, and that's the one that seems to hold. So it seems to me that that's where there's some teeth, is in the economic system that we live in, and it was there that I focused this novel. And then lastly, Jorge, thank you again. As last time a few years ago, you've given me so much to think about. I'll go backwards because I think the hardest thing you brought up was near the beginning. And I love the number 6 tram in your background. That's a Zurich tram, by the way, for our general audience. Thank you for that thoughtfulness. It even looks like Kirk of Flunturn, where my wife and I lived for 2 years. Yes, I like bureaucrats as being the functionaries that work as ordinary people. They work for a living. They don't work for profit. They make things go. They are often put down, and yet we would be lost without them. And indeed, there are some rather great utopias that suggest that everybody needs to be drafted as a bureaucrat for a few years. And I like recontextualizing them as protagonists of our social life. The novel, I write the novel because I'm a novelist, but I also think there's something crazily bold about trying to tell the whole story in one package. There's something audacious about that that appeals to me, obviously. And I think that also we are searching for meaning in a world that is, for many of us, largely secular. So how you create meaning, and even if you're religious, by the stories that you tell. So the stories that are the most absorbing are perhaps creating the most meaning. And also, as you pointed out, they are elements of the discourse of battle. We're in a discourse of battle right now on this planet to try to convince everybody that taking care of the biosphere is the first order of business for civilization right now. So in that discursive battle, if we lose it, it could become a real war. And so it becomes really important to try to tell the story. And the thick texture of a novel where you have a fictional telepathy into other people's minds and a fictional teleportation into other times and places, this is a powerful heuristic device, you might say, in the teaching world. It's a way of thinking that I think creates meaning, and I believe in it. The novel is indeed my religion as well as my political practice. And that brings me to your last and the hardest point, violent activism. This novel describes some actions that I find abhorrent and hope never happen. And yet, for some people on this planet, they will simply be resistance. Resistance to authority, resistance to the destruction of the earth. If the discursive battle turns into the war for the earth, for the fate of the earth, it could get so ugly because there is a new set of weaponry that is that can't be protected against. And one response to that would be to create a police state, a kind of fascistic police state, is the only way to stop this kind of resistance. I would hope for the rule of law instead. And when I wrote this novel, I was intensely nervous, apprehensive. You can see the novel shiver and squiggle under the pressure of trying to have it both ways. I hope it's more of a conversation stimulus than it is a chickening out on my part. And I would say that no matter what I believe as a person, as a novelist, I'm trying to represent the culture and the civilization we're in and be a voice for others. That's what the novel does. And I'm afraid that if we don't take care of things by way of winning the discursive battle, we are in for ugliness that is more than just climactic, but is human against human. And I needed to describe that in ways that was like, I call it the needle in the eyeball, that there are sentences like a needle in the eyeball. And I don't like writing them and I don't like reading them, but it needed to be done. So, Bob, I hope that I have not taken up too much time, but I am indeed done.
Great. Thank you, Cymie. We're exactly on schedule. I want to bounce one more question off of you before I pass it over to the audience questions, which is, I think this is at least the second novel or set of novels you've written that's sort of a near future novel about climate action, where the protagonists are bureaucrats. The other one is a Science in the Capital series, which I think was republished as Green Earth a few years ago. And if I remember correctly, that what you started was first published around 20 years ago. And so I'm curious as to your reflection on sort of what's changed in the world and what's changed in you over that time period that leads to differences between these.
Well, thanks for that. The two are actually not that different in their approach, their method, and even their storylines, except for Green Earth was extremely focused on the U.S. federal bureaucracies, especially the National Science Foundation. I've worked with the National Science Foundation. I like them. My wife is an environmental scientist for U.S. Geological Survey. And between her work for USGS and my own work with NSF, I felt like I wanted a novel that explored something that novels don't usually explore, which is how does our federal government work and at the level of the massive amount of effort that goes into it, the hundreds of thousands of people that put together our democratically elected government. And that was of interest to me. But the problem is that the climate problem is international. And so I've had to spread the focus. And in Ministry for the Future, I wanted to try something that was closer to the present and dealt with problems that we are seeing happening right now. Those were the main differences. And it did get me into questions of international law and practice and cooperation between the nation states. But it also allowed me to go to the planetary level and talk about sea level rise in a proactive way, and to talk about global finance, which I think is key to the puzzle. We need to pay ourselves to do the right things rather than extract profit by doing the wrong things. It's clear that neoliberal capitalism, which was an accidental kludge, it's not an improvisation, in other words, nobody ever designed it on purpose, but what we've come to, it actually very bad for the biosphere and bad for equality amongst humans. It inflicts damage on both people and planet in ways that are unsustainable. It has to change, and what has to happen will happen, because what can't happen won't happen. Things can't go on the way they will. They will change, so we have to imagine a different system, a post-capitalism. It's a shocking challenge given. And I think understudied at this point. So again, it's a kind of a crazy audacity to think that it should really be a kind of a world effort rather than the subject of a science fiction novel. But I think that will follow because we're there. And I do want to briefly pick up a link and thank Naomi Klein for all of her work, but also these little utopian science fiction short stories in the form of animated graphics that are short YouTube videos. They're so beautiful. They're so inspirational. They're seen by a lot of people. They do the work in 6 or 7 minutes that sometimes I have to take maybe 2 years to go through. And it's in the same spirit of solidarity and imagining positive futures. So to the extent that we're a part of a united front, and this is true of all the rest of the panelists and Bob and everybody really, I suppose, listening, a united front working on this discursive battle together, it's fun for me to see something that's so visual, so beautiful, because words are abstract, but images are tangible and visible. And that's been a part of I just recently did an event with Michael E. Mann, the climate scientist, and he said maybe we're near a tipping point towards action, that it seems like many things are conspiring. If we get a good election next month, if we begin to take on our responsibilities under the Paris Agreement, we might indeed get to a point of really acting on this major existential problem. And that's going to be the result of the whole world culture, what Marx called the general intellect. Paying attention enough to the bad future that we're headed towards to say, well, we can change, so let's change.
Thanks. So I want to bring in some ideas from our audience. The first one's from Daniel Guilford, and he's asked about sort of the idea of you mentioned the idea of rich neighborhoods in the opening chapter. And his thoughts were sparked about this idea of some of the work like Neil Stephenson's Snow Crash, where you have a sort of even more bifurcation of sort of the rich living in their own bubbles. And wanted your thoughts on sort of the likelihood of this sort of secession of the rich versus some alternative, and where, what would cause us to go in that direction versus a more egalitarian direction. I think that I'm going to use Stan and Naomi, but anybody who wants to chime in.
Well, I'm happy to declare that to be a kind of a fantasy, and we all do live in fantasy worlds of one sort or another, but this particular fantasy that you could withdraw to mansion islands or gated communities or Mars, if you want to be extreme about it, that these are fantasies of escape that are non-functional, and they don't pay attention to the way in which every person depends on the global culture to survive these days. And I guess the way I'd put it briefly is, you can't get away from the environment. You can't get away from water, the endocrine disruptors. You can't get away into a gated community where the powerful men in this community have 1/5 of the sperm count of men, ordinary male humans just 50 years before, because of the way we're mistreating the earth. That can't be escaped no matter how much money you have. And I think many wealthy people recognize this, but there's something seductive and overpowering about having a lot of money that I think is a big distortion of judgment. I call it the Midas touch. People with that much money no longer know if people are being nice to them or real to them, because their money sits around them, and like King Midas, and everything they touch turns to gold. And when humans turn to gold, it's not a good thing for the person that's turned them. So it would be a relief to the rich to progressively tax in the way that Piketty has suggested, and essentially abolish the ultra-rich by way of intense progressive taxation, with their money being put to good work as decided by the collective.
I want to ask Naomi or any of your other panelists, do you want to add to this discussion?
It's worrying. It's worrying in that it can waste so much time, because I think it's a very, very, very powerful fantasy. I've been saying for a while that I think that climate change denial is actually largely a cover story, and that most, right-wing people, with power don't actually believe climate change isn't real, even if they may be publicly saying it's a hoax or whatever it is. What they believe is that they'll be all right. They believe that their wealth will protect them. And that's why, when I was talking about the biblical story of rapture, in a way, that's like the story of rapture, where like the chosen get lifted up into a gated kingdom in the sky, is sort of like, it's a fantasy of a gated community, right? And actually it's leading to the actual construction of that reality, down here, with like private firefighters. When I wrote The Shock Doctrine, I wrote about a short-lived business called HelpJet that was offering luxury hurricane rescue for the very rich in Florida. It was a real business, and and the slogan was, "Turn your disaster into a luxury vacation." So, I guess I would just say I just feel particularly anxious about it this week, because I think one of the things that's happening now with so many members of the Trump administration getting COVID and getting this kind of gold-plated medical care is that it's reinforcing this fantasy in the public mind that, like, that your wealth will protect you, that it's only the poor who have to worry about these types of diseases. It's not true, as Stan says, but I feel like we're getting a very vivid reinforcement of that damaging narrative right now from the president.
Cymie or Jorge, do you want to chime in on that?
I just can't resist, having lived in Geneva for 6 years, that, of course, Calvin, was the Protestant minister who made his home in Geneva, was also the one who promulgated the idea that if you were wealthy, it was a reflection of the favor that God gave you. And this association of your very wealth justifying your godliness, an enormously distressing kind of religious belief.
Great. So we have another question that's directed to Stan or Naomi. Is asking about, I guess, the financial system. I think we want to ask it. You focus on your monetary policy, and he sort of wants your reaction to MMT, modern monetary theory, and whether that it's whether it's an essential part of some sort of Green New Deal or other societal change.
Sure. It's a pleasure to discuss this within my limited understanding, but I think MMT, modern monetary theory, is important and needs to be fully discussed by the conventional classical economists. To my mind, it's a refurbishing and a return of Keynesianism, arguing that the government is crucial in the economy and can serve to direct, save, and stimulate better patterns for the economy at large when it's under stress. For MMT, what's very different about them is that the creation of new money through quantitative easing, like we saw in 2008, like we saw with the pandemic in this spring, trillions of dollars created from nothing, but given to the banks to do their ordinary predatory lending rather than immediately spent on good works, as in the New Deal of the 1930s, after which it enters the general economy. So MMT insists that government can generate a lot of new money without distressing the people's trust in money or the rate of inflation or deflation. There's even confusion about which occurs if lots of new money floods the system. But if that new money is directed first to good climate work and then enters the rest of the economy, then you no longer have the trap that saving the biosphere is not a profit-making enterprise and therefore won't happen in ordinary capitalism. And the other crucial aspect of MMT that I'm very impressed by is they insist on a job guarantee, that governments become the employer of last resort and offer anyone who wants one a job at a good living wage, which immediately would establish a floor below which private industry could not fall without being unable to attract workers. So this would be a massive intervention, and it resembles very much the height of the New Deal's Works Progress Administration or the CCC, Civilian Conservation Corps, and other works projects that eventually included, of course, the armaments of World War II, which hopefully we won't do that again. But saving the biosphere is an equally urgent task that is also extremely labor intensive. There will never be a lack of jobs, of necessary work to be done by human beings. And so what MMT suggests very powerfully is that a job guarantee, which they capitalize, JG they call it, is fundamental to monetary policy, that everybody needs to be guaranteed a job. Well, this I find a great combination of utopian thinking and practical economics that can engage with the discipline of economics in academia and in think tanks that already exists. And the critique is powerful. It's been resisted. It's a shock to the system. And yet what we've seen in 2008 and in 2020, these massive infusions of quantitative easing have not changed anything in terms of trust in money or the inflation rate. And that can be argued. I'd love to see economists argue it more. But the truth is that this stuff should be on the table.
Naomi, do you want to add on to that?
Yeah, I totally agree. I would really recommend that folks read Stephanie Kelton's book, The Deficit Myth. It's really, really great. My only, and it's interesting because Jerome Powell has been saying that there is no risk of kind of overspending right now, and that there should be more stimulus. I think one downside is that it doesn't address what we were talking about earlier, which is the moral hazard of extreme wealth, right? It does that there is a value in raising money through massive increases in wealth taxing beyond just that it raises money. It's also about closing inequality.
Mm-hmm. All right, and I think we have. I'm gonna combine a couple of topics so that we can get a couple more in before we close out. So one question from Mark Lee is asking about geoengineering, which appears in various forms, Stan, in a number of your models, your novels.
I like that.
So it's actually what do you view as a role of sort of technological bombs like that? Are they narrative color, or do you think they're likely to be deployed? And then the second question relates to sort of what you call the discourse battle, and I'm just going to spin off of that and say, like, one thing that I feel like we've seen a lot over the last several months is continued splitting of people into their own sort of narrative bubbles that don't intersect very much. It's facilitated by social media and the fact that people aren't having much human connection with one another. And I sort of just wanted to get your reflections on, sort of how the sort of splitting of worldviews and understanding of truth. I mean, you looked at one of the candidates last night who seemed to have his completely own set of reality he was describing that was distinct from the one I live in. But if you could just spin off that idea of like sort of social media and bifurcation of views, and go to Stan, and then we'll let everybody else chime in.
Sure. Very briefly, I think that geoengineering has become a name for things that are bad that we don't want to do, so that there's nobody that seems to like the term. There are scientists studying various proposed global methods of, say, lowering the temperature of the Earth or stabilizing sea level, etc., or decarbonizing quickly. They're a mixed bag. And my point is this: if we get into an emergency where wet bulb temperatures are striking down and killing millions, which is what my novel explores, there are going to be nation states that will simply initiate solar radiation management because it's cheap and it's possible. And the rest of the world is going to have nothing to say to them, because by and large, they won't have been major carbon burners. It's the developing world that suffers what the developed world has done, and we will have no moral standing. Also, the moral hazard argument that if we could do some techno silver bullet fix and save things without reducing our carbon burn, that would reduce the pressure on us to reduce carbon burning fast. I think we're past all that we're in an all hands on deck moment where we're getting so close to the bad zones that have been defined in climate change that we can go ahead and start talking about geoengineering as something we might have to do in an emergency basis. So I'm open to the idea, but also I want to expand things. Geoengineering is defined as humanity doing something massive to the Earth to change its climate. Well, we've already done that by accident, by burning a ton of carbon and by deforestation, and civilization itself has been geoengineering all along, right from the get-go. And yet now when we do it on purpose to try to make things better, I don't think there's any reason to intrinsically object, especially if you think about things like justice. Environmental justice helps to stabilize the climate. Women's rights very strongly helps to stabilize the climate, because the population rate of growth begins to drop and even go down, and that would be helpful if it was voluntary and slow. So if you think of the software technologies like justice, language, and women's rights as geoengineering techniques that are more powerful than the techno bullets, then the subject can come back on the table in a more productive way. And then very briefly, social bubbles, we just need a working political majority. I think this is being exaggerated partly by social media in this sense. I think we always lived in separate ideological spaces that are quite distinct from each other. And now it's become very much in our face. Everybody's aware of it, but it was always true. And so this is another name for politics. you only need 51%, 55%, 60%. It depends on which particular political system and battle you're in. You get that working majority, and the side that loses, you have to insist on rule of law, on the state's monopoly on violence. You have to hope for the best and hold the line, and not worry too much about convincing everybody on this planet, because they are indeed living in completely different ideologies, which are an imaginary relationship to the real situation that is so powerful that in many ways, in many instances, you're not going to be able to change them. So it's politics. Get that working majority, do the necessary things.
So I'm going to turn Cymie and then Naomi. It looks like we lost Jorge. And I also want to ask both of you to respond to those two topics, and if also any concluding thoughts you want to leave us with.
It's a great temptation just to leave with Stan's last remarks as a summation, but you gave me the opportunity, and damn it, I'm a college professor, so I'll take it. And I actually have the pleasure currently of teaching a freshman seminar in climate intervention, geoengineering with Alan Roebuck, who is a meteorologist at Rutgers, who has written extensively on this. And one of the things that I appreciate very much about both what I've learned from Alan and what you've done, Stan, is to elaborate and unpack this idea about climate intervention. You talk about many techniques, including the technique of dealing with the slipping glaciers in Antarctica as geoengineering. You describe in the book that what we've done to the climate already is geoengineering. And I think that's important to recognize and to be more nuanced in our use of words about it. This is really one of the areas that the questions about who can make, can Elon Musk decide to do solar radiation management? Can India? And it's easy to become somewhat indignant and say, how could India do that? And after you read the first chapter of the book, which Stan read part of, but if you read that whole chapter, don't read it just before bed, but you will appreciate why unilateral decision-making about climate intervention might seem appropriate and why countries wouldn't object. My final comment really is, and thank you for the chance to make it, I think that I'm constantly defending international law. I think that it's common belief that it's toothless. I think most law is toothless unless either it's backed up with military force, but that's not the kind of law that we embrace. That's not rule of law. The kind of law we embrace is the law that is held up and enforced by a system of normative beliefs. Our belief as a society that this is the right thing to do. And there's an interplay, and this works internationally too, that when we articulate law in an international agreement or an international court decision or a declaration like the Stockholm Declaration on the Environment, we set the norms, we aspire to those norms, and there's a virtuous circle. As we do that, the norms become strengthened and we seek further. And that's why we've had a growth of environmental agreements. That's why we have the majority of countries at the United Nations, which is to say the majority of the countries on this earth, negotiating a treaty right now to protect biodiversity on the high seas. It's not easy, but constantly, it's a process, it's not an end state. Thank you.
Thank you, Cymie. Enrico, Jorge's back, so I just want to give you a quick chance to provide any concluding thoughts, and then I'm going to give Naomi the last word before I conclude. Jorge.
Right. Yes. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
I'm as a concluding remark, of course, the only important thing that I have to say is to recommend the reading of the novel. I think Stan is right in that we have probably overlooked the importance of the novel of a genre for putting everything together. To practice that kind of holistic intersectional, transdisciplinary perspective. The extension of the novel, which may be something that we find as a liability in these times, that we feel that the communication is so urgent, is precisely its strength. And that there are many ways in which the novel achieves what Stan was bringing up. This is a battle of discourses in which we have to share, we have to tell the stories of all those initiatives, geoengineering or social innovation, that we need to hear about in order to see if we can scale them up at a different level. We need a narrative that tells us about try to understand the inaction and how to that reflects on the inaction and how to deal with that still in terms of discourses and in general the whole idea that the novel itself can help us develop that kind of necessary thinking for dealing with this. There is a lot of in the novel as well in terms of that tipping point towards action that Stan was commenting. There is a certain point, there is no major turning point in a way in the novel. All of a sudden, there is an accumulated effect of many things going on that start producing a significant reduction of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So I think it's a very interesting and worthy narrative to share and explore as well. Thank you, Stan.
Thanks, Jorge. Naomi? You're on mute.
Oh, I'm on mute. I think I'm off mute. Okay,
I just unmuted you.
All right, great. Yeah, just kind of picking up quickly on the solar radiation management piece. I mean, the moral force of the scenario that Stan lays out is really it's really hard to argue. I mean, you can't argue with it, right? This is a crisis created overwhelmingly by the wealthy world, felt first and worst by those least responsible for creating it. If there is a way to stop it, people are going to reach for that lever. My concern is just, having read Alan Robock's and other people's research about Pinatubo, the interference with the monsoons. What the scenario that I was most worried about was that panic reaction actually coming from the north. And, say like the wheat crops are wiped out, in Kansas one year, and an American president sacrifices India's monsoon to save us, which would be more in keeping with actually the way the developed world, the wealthy world, has treated the global south throughout the climate crisis, which is essentially as a sacrifice zone, even in the way in which we have set temperature targets at, defining dangerous warming at levels that allow, island nations to sink. So, that's what's always worried me about these technologies, because I see it as much more likely that they would be deployed in the unjust way that we have been already altering the planet so yeah, I just want to say that. Thanks so much for shouting out the little films that we've been making about our messages from the future. And of course, the person who makes them so beautiful is Molly Crabapple. So much love to her. And I put a link to our latest one in the chat if people are interested. And somebody in the chat just said, don't leave us without a call to arms or a call to action. And so, I just say that when Trump was elected, I made the argument that we should see him as dystopian fiction. That he, if we think about dystopian fiction as being a form of art that just holds up a mirror and says, this is the logical conclusion of everything you've been doing. So we have an opportunity to cancel that bad dystopian show going on. And I guess the only call to action I can really think of involves getting people to vote at the moment. Not because, when I lived in Argentina a decade or so ago, I was there during a general election, and there was this slogan that they used in the social movements, which was "Our dreams don't fit on your ballots." And I think that that's true. Like, the future that will keep us safe isn't on the ballot, not from anyone who could actually win. We saw that last night in the VP debates. Full-throated endorsements of fracking, it would seem. But the truth is, as Alicia Garza said some years ago, we're not necessarily voting for a candidate, we're voting for the terrain on which to fight. So that's the way I think we should see this election. I hope that'll do for a call to action for now.
Thanks, Emily. And Stan, I want to give you a chance to have final remarks before we conclude.
Sure. I'll be brief. I want to thank everybody. It's been a wonderful hour and a half for me. I have to say, it's a peculiar experience. I spend a couple of years on my front porch working on these novels, and it's a strange existence, monk-like and isolated. And then to be able to discuss it with people is so interesting in their perspectives on the world, with experiences and with knowledge that I myself don't have. It's like being the telephone operator in a 1940s movie where I plug in plugs and then voices come through and I write them down. These are my novels. But then to hear from the people actually speaking like I have tonight, it's a huge pleasure and inspirational for me in terms of, maybe I should try again somehow, which I actually don't want to do. But something like this is extremely affirming. And politically, I just want to back what Naomi said. Let's do our best to vote ourselves into a more positive course of history. It's never perfect, but it's better to try for the positive rather than give up to the negative. And you can see that happening. So it's, I just want to end by thanking you very, very much. And Bob, it's twice now you've done this. I love it. I hope we do it again. I hope we do it in person. So I'll cross my fingers for that.
Great.
Thanks.
Thank you, Stan. Thank you, Naomi, Cymie, and Jorge. And thank you all for showing up. And vote.gov if you need information on where to vote. Thanks, everybody.